All right, you guys. So, welcome to the show. I have a great guest today. Robin is actually visiting me or joining the show today, all the way from Germany. So, I appreciate his time. And Robin, these days, I'm surprised it's 2025 and we still have to have this discussion on the obvious. But these days, there are a lot of I would say, data-driven health researchers like MDs or registered dietitians that are I would say making data-free assumptions on claiming like the safety of various pesticides or biocides, whatever you want to refer them to. And I just wanted to kind of invite someone that has done a lot of in-depth actual research instead of the people actually just reading the research, but a person that's actually done the research themselves on the show today to clarify a lot of the details in terms of how this safety testing is done, maybe some of the shortcomings of the safety testing, how persistent it is in the environment, et cetera, et cetera. That way the listener can have a more clear understanding of what goes into various biocides, and then they can make an informed decision for themselves, whether they want to continue to eat produce or other food products that are exposed to a lot of these biocides. So my first question is, can you go over the details of testing various biocides? We can even stick to herbicides, for example, to make it more specific on active ingredients versus complete formulations of testing.
Yes, thank you for having me in your show. And this is a very interesting topic when we talk about the authorization for these products. And we can talk about pesticides as an example, but it should be clear that it's almost the same regulatory process for every chemical that we use in our daily life because we are exposed to pesticides. It's really a good example of some of these chemicals which can intoxicate our health, but it's also plastics, flame retardants. There's much more, and they have all the same shortcomings. And it's clear that when you look at these products, it's been since 50 years, 60 years that we start knowing the danger of these chemicals. And it's always the same. We have a treadmill where we start getting information on one chemicals, we see that it is toxic, one pesticide, and then we keep underestimating this toxicity because then we keep having it on the market or we replace it by something which is poorly tested. And it's because, yeah, there's a lot of shortcomings of these regulatory tests because when a pesticide or any chemical is tested, it's always with a battery of tests which is recognized to be valid internationally. But because this international recognition is taking a long time to be established, in the end, you are testing these chemicals with tests which are decades old. And so now we know that the danger for these pesticides, this is, for instance, their ability to disrupt your endocrine system, your metabolism, your microbiota. Like this is the science which is trendy now that we know are really like a big problem, but this is still not assessed in regulatory tests. So that's always dragging behind. And so these tests, basically, they are valid for the science we had 30 years ago, and they are always dragging behind, which means that when a product is tested, we always underestimate the toxicity and it being debated then for decades. And during that time, this product is on the market and people get intoxicated. And when we ban the pesticide after 20 years of debate, we replace it by something else, which is then generally having another effect, which is underestimated. And this is this treadmill of authorizing a chemical where we underestimate the toxicity because the science is outdated. And then it's on the market, intoxicating people. Then we see it's toxic. The regulatory authorities ban it, but it's too late. And then we have this replacement, and that keeps going.
Well, can you touch on, because a lot of times a typical consumer that's not in this field would think like, hey, safety testing is done like they take a complete formulation, like what you see at Home Depot here in the
Yeah.
US, like Roundup. and you spray it on some product, then you test it for safety. But that's not actually how it's done. From my understanding, at least in the US,
Yes.
it's done that they just test the active leaches, which could be even 1% of the entire formulation sometimes, in isolation on its own, and then kind of make a data-free assumption and that complete formulation is just as safe. Can you
Yeah.
touch on your experience with even whose idea that was to test that way? I know probably because of less moving variables, it makes it easier to isolate certain tests, but
Yeah.
whose idea was it to make it applicable for real life safety scenarios to make the testing done that way?
Yeah, this is a very good point because this is when I talked about this shortcoming of pesticides regulation. One of the big one is that we are actually very rarely testing the pesticide itself. We are testing one molecule that we call the active ingredient, and this is sometimes just a small fraction of the pesticides. And to take it from first basic explanation, when we have a pesticide, it's always a cocktail of different molecules. One we call the active ingredient, and this is always mixed with other surfactants, dyes, stabilizers, emulsifiers, like other molecules which are also meant to give the activity to pesticides. But the regulation has chosen to say these are not important. They are inert because they are not the active ingredient which will kill a plant or an insect. But the fact that the molecule which is dangerous for a plant is the most active in a plant doesn't mean that it's also the case for us. And so the regulation then always test the toxicity of the active ingredient first when we talk about a pesticide like the Roundup, for instance. Most common herbicide in the US is glyphosate-based herbicide. Glyphosate is the active ingredient. So when the regulatory authorities want to know the toxicity of Roundup as a use of a pesticide by farmers, they will look at the toxicity of glyphosate only when we talk about long-term toxicity, especially like chronic toxicity, reproductive toxicity, neurotoxicity, all the toxicity which is mostly chronic. It's done only with glyphosate. And in this case, this is also the same for all the pesticides. And this is completely underestimating the danger of these pesticides, because when I have done this research on glyphosate, I have seen straight away that when we talk about toxicity for human cells, animals, the formulation is always more toxic than the active ingredient. So we always underestimate the toxicity on human population by looking just at active ingredients. And you were asking also, where does it come from? And it's actually, I'm not so sure, because it's like really now old, these decisions, but I have heard from regulatory officials like talking that basically when the regulation on pesticide was introduced in the 60s, really like a long time ago, it was quite an emergency measure. They were seeing effects of pesticide in wild animals. There was a urgent need to test these pesticides, and they went for the most simplistic approach because there were so many pesticides already in the market. They could not test the 20, 30 different formulations of every pesticide. So instead of testing 20 formulations of 20 active ingredients, which would be like 400 batteries of tests to conduct, they say, okay, we focus on the active ingredients because that's the main molecule, and we will ignore the rest. And that's how they reduce the complexity of the problem, which I think it's fair as a first emergency approach to say, okay, let's focus on this most important fact. But then the problem is that it stayed like that. And industry then For manufacturer, it was also like a good thing because then they could change the formulation of their
Hmm.
product very quickly to adapt to market demand. And for competition, for business, this is good for them because they can change their formulation every year, change the name, change the recipe, but then they just say, okay, this is still a glyphosate-based herbicide, so they can put whatever they want inside, and then they are exempt from other regulation. It's very good for business. And as we know in our society, generally, business is what is the driving force of like economy and not health. And so in this case, the toxicity consideration that was secondary. And so that's how we had this mainstream approach of just focusing on one molecule, ignoring the cocktail effect, even if we know in science that this is real. Cocktails are making these molecules more toxic, and we keep ignoring that, even now, 50 years, 60 years after all these first discoveries.
Yeah, I also found with my research, it was even tough. Like even if you go on PubMed.gov, a lot of the researchers even there, like they're like, oh, we're testing like glyphosate based Roundup, but there's so many different variations of Roundup too. And a lot of times they didn't even know, they just kind of classified it as just one product. So it was even tough to find legitimate safety studies done on a specific like Roundup product. I think last time I checked, there might have been more than 100 different variations of Roundup. I'm not sure. It's been a little while since I looked.
Yeah, I've heard 750, and it's true that I had this trouble when I was looking first. Okay, what has been done on these pesticides as a safety study by scientists? I looked on PubMed, and yes, I looked at many studies, and they were looking like very contradictory. The findings were looking
Hmm.
like completely opposite to each other. But then I started to realize that, yeah, people were saying, okay, we tested glyphosate, but in the end, they used a formulation of Roundup and you don't know which one.
Hmm.
And it makes it very complicated because then when a regulatory agency wants to evaluate what the scientific community has been doing, they look at all these studies, but it looks like it has been not well done because the findings look completely contradictory. And it's just because people don't say exactly what they have been testing.
Yeah, and I also find like especially, and some of them are like really popular like data influencers. There's a lot of confusion about again like how this testing is done because a lot of times I would say like um, I would reach out to the influencer and say like, oh, uh, you're making a data-free assumption by claiming to your million plus audience that these pesticides are completely safe and they can buy inorganic fruit versus organic fruit or something of that sort. And they're like, no, here are all the studies. And I'm like, well, all these studies are testing glyphosate. That's not the formulation. They're like, well, that's industry standard and that's good enough. That's good enough to prove that the product is safe. And I'm like, well, prove to me like where, because for my studies that I've done, you could explain it in way more detail. Glyphosate as an active ingredient in isolation on its own, it's like fairly weak. But then, of course, when you throw all the inert ingredients in there, which of course is meant to make it stronger, that's the whole point of it. Of course, it becomes a lot more potent and persistent in the environment at that point. But can you touch on like how strong glyphosate is in isolation on its own versus what you've seen as a complete formulation?
Yes, it's clear that when glyphosate is alone, it's weak even as a herbicide because it will not penetrate in the plants, and this is why these cocktails are here to make it efficient, to make it toxic. And so it's clear that glyphosate in humans, for instance, to talk about this herbicide, it has some toxic properties by itself. Like clearly, glyphosate at very high dose can act as a carcinogen. This is where I think quite now established because it can damage, like it can cause some oxidative stress, damaging DNA. We know the chain of events, but this happen only at very high level because glyphosate alone, it will be only as weakly cytotoxic. But when you add these other molecules which are in the formulations, they will amplify the entrance of glyphosate in the cells. So there will be much more, in fact, glyphosate ending in our cells. And these ingredients also have their own toxicity. And so you end up with a toxic cocktail, which is sometimes quite unpredictable. And we could see from the studies that I did, it was clear that depending on the formulation, because they are all different, some formulations are as toxic as glyphosate alone, because they just have very inert ingredient, very weak, some things which are not so toxic. But some formulations, they make glyphosate very toxic. And it's, in this case, even difficult to quantify, because it's in this case, you have this case where basically you have laboratory animals, you treat them with glyphosate, nothing happened, and then you have the formulation and it's toxic. And so it's like 10, 100, or maybe 1,000 times more toxic sometimes than just
Hmm.
glyphosate alone, because of this still black box of what happened in the formulation, because most of these formulations, they are still confidential business information. So when we
Hmm.
test it, even if you take all the precaution in the world to test the formulation as best as you can, you don't understand what's inside. And so it's very difficult in the end to make a claim of toxicity, because it's always relative and it can change from one year to another. And even we don't know if every batch of formulation is the same, because when you talk about these formulations of pesticides, there's glyphosate, there's the other molecules like surfactants, dyes, emulsifiers, which help the toxicity of glyphosate. But then there's also contaminants of these. There's contaminants which are known, like dioxane, which can be a carcinogen. And these are not well measured in the formulation. And so you end up having this really unpredictable effect of these toxic cocktails.
Do you know, when it says like other ingredients or proprietary blend, have you guys ever contacted the company and asked them for that list? Or is that like totally kept secret all the time, even from researchers?
Yeah, this is always confidential business information. So when you ask companies, and they will tell you that basically this is for keep preserving their business competitivity, they will not want to say what are the composition of the formulations. Some of them are accessible. I'm not even sure why, because maybe after some time it becomes public information. But
Hmm.
on some pesticide, you will have some part of the ingredients disclosed. Some of them it's not. So even for that, I don't fully understand exactly, because this is very complex regulation. But you never have access to the full information, even if there is a debate on glyphosate toxicity, lawsuits, like big deals about the toxicity of a pesticide made publicly. This is kept confidential, because this is business information.
Hmm. I don't know how it is in the EU, but I think the reason it's kept confidential is because they probably patented here, and then they have
Yes.
20 years of private rights to that particular
Mm,
patented product. But then after 20 years, I believe it becomes public domain.
that could be
Um,
the case,
so
yeah,
I don't know if
likely.
it's I know in the US too, I don't know if it's the same in the UK, but the safety
Mm,
studies are done in-house by scientists that are on the payroll by these chemical companies, and they're sent to the Food and Drug Administration for kind of review and approval,
yeah.
which I feel is like a huge conflict of interest all around, especially when a lot of the higher ups in the FDA then go work for these companies after they retire, so they don't want to kind of rock the boat, you know? Is
Yeah.
it the same kind of environment in the EU as well?
Yes, because this is done internationally. So when you have a company applying for pesticide authorization in the US, they will have the same data in the EU. And so this is always the case, that the companies, they don't have their own labs. And so they will pay some external labs to do the study on their products. And this is supposed to be like all standardized, and even if it's not transparent, it's supposed to be fair and safe, because this is standard. But we know from public health scandals that because this is confidential, there is always the problem that they can cherry pick what they present to authorities. And in this case, there is a big conflict of interest. The solution will be easy, that in this case, that government ask for full transparency, and that they ask that every study which is done for the safety of a product, that it is registered in advance, like it is done for drugs, like the clinical trials. They have to be registered in advance so that there is a track record, and we cannot just remove a study and these results from a track record. And that would be an easy way, like just a decision which is that cost no money to just ask for pre-registration of toxicity tests.
Hi everyone, thanks for tuning into the podcast. I'm curious, have you ever been confused by the labels in the grocery store? In Yevgeny's book, he demystifies the difference between caged, cage-free, free-range, and pasture-raised meats. He also covers how to avoid GMOs, source high-quality water, fish, supplements, and other related topics. It's a beautifully illustrated, non-technical read that comes with a comprehensive video series and other extended learning materials. Jump on Amazon and check out the book titled Anti-Factory Farm Shopping Guide by Eugene Trufkin. Now let's dive back into the podcast.
Have you ever seen any convincing studies on how, like, for example, glyphosate in isolation affects the microbiome versus the entire formulation?
Yeah, that is a topic that I studied a lot in my last years of research, because glyphosate, yes, it is acting in a way in plants like it doesn't have a target obvious on human cells, but because of the way it targets plants, it can also target bacteria in the gut and elsewhere. And so this was always a safety question. Is glyphosate having effect on the microbiota? And because the regulatory science has always decades of delay, there is no test in the regulatory science to test if any chemical has an effect on microbiota. This is never tested. And so we did the first studies looking at effects of glyphosate on the microbiota, but it was very difficult to do because when the microbiota is also something that we don't know fully. And so when we test it on laboratory animals, because we don't know well this microbiota, in the end, like we don't know what are the bacteria in the gut of laboratory animals. So it's very difficult to do a very deep study, but we did it. And what we found is that glyphosate, it can disturb the microbiota because it can interact with the same pathways in plants. That is clear. It acts on the microbiota in the same way then it kills plants. And so in this way, it can kill some bacteria. Some others will survive. And so this ecosystem in the gut, which is quite stable generally, it is unstable because it is targeted by glyphosate. And then what we found in a study is that you can have some pathogens then which normally is pathogen in the gut. If it's healthy, they are kept in check because of the stability of the microbiota. But then because glyphosate will disturb this microbiota, the pathogen, some fungi, for instance, they can start proliferating, and they will damage the intestine because it creates some oxidative stress. And so the effect of glyphosate on the microbiota, they can even have effect on the whole body, because when you disturb the gut, it has effect then on all other organs. And so glyphosate can do that at mostly high doses. Again, here, this is a case where glyphosate has a clear effect, but it's not very, very toxic. Then when you add all the surfactants, we don't know exactly what it does to the gut microbiota. We were not able to really go to the bottom of this, but it was clear that the adjuvants were adding another layer of toxicity And in this case, maybe they were disturbing the bacteria. Maybe they were amplifying the entrance of glyphosate. We don't know exactly what it does, but bottom line is that, yeah, clearly the gut microbiota is one target of glyphosate. And this was always underestimated by toxicity tests because it was never studied.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I presume it would make it very difficult because I also remember reading a report like the average newborn in the US born in a metropolitan area was already born with trace amounts of about 200 plus different synthetic chemicals in their blood samples. So now you have like a huge synergistic or cocktail effects of God knows how many chemicals, complete formulations going on all at the same time. Um, do you know if there is any um, safety testing done on these pesticides regarding like neurotoxicity? Have you seen anything done in that area?
There are So the studies which are done on neurotoxicity, this is mandatory by authorities to do some study on neurotoxicity, but they are generally done on neurotoxicity in adults to understand what happens. But they are rarely done to understand if exposure during pregnancy will have effects later in life. And that type of studies are not mandatory. So most of the pesticides which are on the market, they have never been tested for that, but it's clear that in human populations, especially when we talk about insecticides, many insecticides, they have effects during pregnancy, which can alter the development of babies and then lead to effects later on like hypertension, not hypertension, but hyperactivity, this ADHD spectrum, autism, deficit in IQ. And this is the case for many insecticides. One of the famous examples is chlorpyrifos, which has been pointed out by so many studies to be neurotoxic during pregnancy. But because the regulatory studies were never done on chlorpyrifos during pregnancy, industry and the regulation is always saying now there is no sufficient evidence because they don't take into account the scientific studies. And it's clear that then when you look at the mixture of all pesticides, insecticides, fungicides, herbicides, and then you add the plasticizers, the air pollution, you end up with this soup of chemicals, which is clearly having an effect. It's obvious from studies in human population, but to get to the bottleneck and understand which molecule at which concentration and with which interaction, that's a puzzle. It's impossible to solve.
Yeah, I honestly, in my personal opinion, I don't even know why you would need to answer it at that level. It's clear that it has some kind of negative effect, quite a
Yeah.
bit of negative effects on human health, and that should be enough to go like, oh, okay. And like you mentioned at the beginning of the podcast, it's always the same story. The chemical is released, then they're like, it's perfectly safe, tested from start to finish by the best scientist ever in the world. Then 20 years go by. Actually, not the case. Okay, let's get rid of it and add a new one. And it's like, again and again, it's like, how many times can people be fooled by the same exact tactic, like over and over again? And then on top of that, I mean, the bigger picture is like most of the industrial operations that rely heavily on these are just unsustainable anyways altogether. I know that's a whole different topic altogether, which reinforces the further use of these chemicals, you know, until the soil is completely gone at a certain point, and then you can't use that land for quite a while. um, have you can you explain also if you have like any experience with, I know a lot of times, again, like we mentioned, active ingredients are tested in isolation on its own, which is never how it's used out in the field. But on top of that, even if a single complete formulation is tested in the laboratory as well, it's also, I believe, not reflective of how it's actually used in real life, because in any farming cycle, a farmer could use like a myriad of different biocides to make that crop successful that year. Can you explain like the synergistic effect, if there's any, between various biocides when they're used together?
Yeah, it's clear that there are synergistic effects, and that's why the farmers are mixing them. It's because it's more efficient, and when you look at how farming practice are done, it's clear that in most cases, they don't use only one single pesticide. Either the pesticides are already sold, mixed together, different active ingredients, or they mix it in the tank together. But this is how it's efficient, and this is because they have synergistic effects. And these synergistic effects, we don't know them very well because it's very difficult to do the studies. And like you said, it's sometimes we don't need to get to the bottom of that to have sufficient reasons to ban some of these pesticides. But it's clear that I've seen studies where basically the scientists were really looking, okay, at one important molecule enzyme in the body, and that there was one pesticide which went on one side of the pocket of the enzyme and the other pesticide which went on the back, and that was creating a synergistic effect. And when you get to the bottom of that, at this level, this is years of work, but do we need that even? Yeah, I'm not so sure. It's clear.
Well, what are some steps you're, with all of your knowledge and all of your research now, what are some steps you're taking to reduce your exposure to, since you're using pesticides, I'll just go back to doing that instead of saying biocides back and forth all the time. But what are you doing personally in your life to reduce your exposure to pesticides?
Yeah, it's my exposure to pesticide. I'm trying to reduce it mostly by acting on my diet, because this is where you get most of the pesticide, like depending on where you live, of course, because if you live near crops, there's also like different actions. But if you live inside a city, for instance, like you can act on your diet, and for that, buying organic food if you can afford it, because this is always sometimes a problem also. But it's also something which is a good action to do is to prepare your own food, because it avoids many chemicals which are in pre-made food and plastics, and that can only amplify the effect. But yeah, prepare your own food and use like organic ingredients. That is really a one key measure. Also, like in houses, sometimes we also underestimate that there are pesticides which are used like to protect clothing, for instance, when they are sold, and to also like we use pesticides sometimes to control like mosquitoes or pests in our houses, and that is also something to avoid. People also like maybe one, if I have to say, the most extreme case people didn't realize is that they were putting some collars on their dogs and cats to control fleas and like parasites. But these are collars which are just like loaded with grams of pesticides. And that's in this case a way for people to get intoxicated by pesticides are at orders of magnitude much higher than they would by food. And they don't realize that basically, as when you use like these products in your home, insecticides, dog collars, you are exposed to high level of pesticides that are dangerous because they are here, in this case, at levels much higher than you would find in the food or elsewhere in the environment.
Do you buy like organic food from like the grocery store, or do you tend to find like a local like rancher or farmer and source directly from them?
I'm trying when I can to take the organic food from a farm, because I know that also, I'm not sure in the US how it is, but in Europe, organic has become also like a brand to sell more, and organic regulation is becoming weaker and weaker. And so on in supermarkets now, many supermarket chains, they have made their the point of making a business out of organic. And so you have many organic products which are like industrial product, like ultra processed food almost, which is organic. And in this case, you cannot expect any benefit from that, because this is really contrary to the point of protecting your health, because you you may not even have benefits of less pesticide exposure in this case because this is ultra processed food. So when buying organic, like focusing on fruits and vegetables is really the key point, but I would not pay a premium to buy a chocolate bar, which is organic if it's just like processed food.
Yeah. I also find like a lot of the influencers are mentioning, they're like, oh, well, organic uses pesticides too. And I'm like, well, spraying vinegar and water or salt and water on one apple and then spraying Roundup on another apple, like what would you rather be eating, you know? Or spraying copper or something of that sort. Um, I don't know. It's no
Yeah,
comparison. And
this
then on
is
top
true.
of that, if it's a legitimate organic farm, you rarely use any, even yeah, any of those natural like
Yeah,
biocides in
yeah, this
general
is true.
altogether. Um, okay, let me see. Have you, when doing your research and coming out with, you know, studies showing there's obviously a detrimental effect from glyphosate alone on the human body, did you get any pushback from industry or anything of that sort?
Well, there was a lot of pushbacks from industry when we were publishing the studies, and there was often a response and the classic response was that it's not done according to the international norm of regulation, so it's not valid. That was always the answer. Then there was also like pushbacks, which were about like attacking. We have been also like attacked in a way, like not attacked in a personal way, like with violence, but attacking the journal by sending an email to the editor-in-chief of the scientific journal to say that this is not good research, to try to retract the article. Also, there was like investigation by journalists showing that some lobbying agencies, they were also like working with influencers on social media to try to discredit the research and the researchers. So this is like all techniques which are done to generally discredit the research. I didn't experience so much personally because when I did the research, it was like the most like hot research I did was really at the beginning on glyphosate, beginning of my career. And my PhD supervisor was really taking a lot of the blame. He wanted to protect his team. And that was really noble of him because it was very difficult to navigate through the storm so that I was not exposed personally too much to problems.
Was this the research you're referring to? Was this Seralini or?
Yes, yeah,
Sure.
Professor Seralini. We worked together for about 10 years, and he was really quite courageous in taking the storm and attacks to protect the work of the team so that we can really continue doing the studies.
What is he up to? I haven't followed his work for quite a while. Is he still a researcher?
Yeah, he's still active and mostly now taking the time to write books, also taking more time with his family because it was he worked a lot in the eyes of the storm for the toxicity of glyphosate and these debates, and now he's less active but still active.
Got it. Okay. Well, I'm thankful for you guys doing the ground research because it really helped fast track my learning curve in the process. So I guess Robin, final statement. Uh, with especially parents with kids, is it safe to expose your kids to these chemicals, or is it not safe?
Yeah, in a nutshell, it's clear that exposing kids to chemicals, pesticides, and other, this is not safe because we don't know their toxicity well, and we need to protect our kids from that. This is clear.
Cool. And do you have any good resources and books that people can further investigate if they're interested in this topic?
There are good books. I don't remember the names exactly, like books on endocrine disruptors, which are among the chemicals we are exposed. Endocrine disruptors are really like the most dangerous. Some pesticides can be endocrine disruptors, but it's not just the pesticides. But I would not have any book titles in mind, but looking at the mainstream researchers which have published on endocrine disruptors, we'll find some interesting books, I think.
Yeah, and for the listeners, the book I really like, which is kind of easy and straightforward, is The Myth of Safe Pesticides by Andre Liu. That one's really straightforward and a good introduction book that gets to the point of like a lot of the answers you would be looking for.
Yeah,
So
super.
yeah, Robin, I'm happy to touch on any other work you're currently doing right now, or happy to promote your work in any way. Is there anything you would like to share with the audience that you're currently up to?
Well, I can just share about my recent work just for information. I don't think there is no promotion to do, but yeah, for information, I moved more on the subject of looking at nutrition and fasting strategies, because I see that there's bigger and bigger metabolic problems in our society with type 2 diabetes, obesity, which can really be solved with the diet, and having more periods of fasting in our life is a part of this. But I still incorporate the knowledge about clean diets and safe chemicals in these studies, because it's always the same. Like when we talk, food is like our medicine, so it can be our medicine. And for food to be our medicine, it should be clean food, and it should be also eaten in the right amount at the right time. This is important.
Yeah. Well, is there a website anyone can find your information on?
Not so much, actually. I have a
Yeah.
website, but it's not really updated. So just by Googling my name will be probably the best. Following me on social networks, that
Got
would
it.
do the job, because that is where I am most active. Instagram and LinkedIn, this is where I post the most, and I'm trying to popularize this science.
Cool. Yeah, that's an indication that you're a real researcher. I find the real hardcore researchers never, never if ever have a website, and if they do, it's always like from like 1990 or something like that, you
Yeah.
know? So, okay, Robin. Well,
Well,
I
thank you for
appreciate your
having me.
time. Yeah, and thank you again personally for helping me in my journey and fast track my journey as well. So I highly appreciate it. I know it took uh, years and years of research to help
Yeah.
me understand what was the problem in like a few minutes of reading your papers and everything, you know? So highly
Super.
appreciate it. And of course, you know, keep up the good work. I know, unfortunately, for a lot of people, this message will go in one ear and out the other, you know, because a lot of people have
Yes.
normalized mental and
It's a
physical illness.
difficult topic.
Yeah, but for the 1 out of 10 that are really in tune and interested in optimizing their health, at least they have
Yeah,
the answers they're
important
looking for.
lessons.
So, okay. Thank
Thank
you.
you.
And have a good night, okay?
Yes, thank you.
Okay.
Thanks for tuning into the podcast. If you've ever had trouble losing weight, or you've lost weight, but still didn't have the ideal body or health you're aiming for, please feel free to reach out anytime and book an assessment. Eugene will work with you to cover your goals in detail, see what's holding you back, and go from there. In the meantime, feel free to check out the countless testimonials on Eugene's website in the link below. In the testimonial section, you'll notice everyone has various backgrounds, are of all different ages, and all have had different challenges in their life, but they all have one thing in common: they were all able to find their health and achieve their ideal body. You're also welcome to add yourself to the Facebook group in the link below. There you'll have access to the live videos that Eugene does weekly on Sundays, and other helpful content. Thank you again for tuning in.